We are proud members of the Spy Podcast Network. Find out more at www.spypodcasts.com.
Due to the themes of this podcast, listener discretion is advised.
For the last 20 years, Russia's been described as this heavily corrupt. I mean, mafia state isn't just corruption. There's corruption in most countries. This is way, way far deeper and a stagnant, corrupt country. Now, if that's the case, why did Western experts assume that the Russian military would be exempt from this corruption? Well, no. If the country is a mafia state, that impacts on everything in Russia, including the security forces, the military.
Lock your doors, close the blinds, change your passwords. This is Secrets and Spies. Secrets and Spies is a podcast that dives into the world of espionage, terrorism, geopolitics, and intrigue. This podcast is produced and hosted by Chris Carr.
On today's podcast, I'm joined by Taras Kuzio, who is a professor of political science at the National University of Kyiv Mohyla Academy, and he is the author of two books, Russian Nationalism and the Russian-Ukrainian War, which came out earlier this year, and his second book, Fascism and Genocide, Russians' War Against Ukrainians, which is coming out earlier next year. On this episode, we discuss the latest developments on the Russian war on Ukraine. Without further ado, let's get going.
The opinions expressed by guests on Secrets and Spies do not necessarily represent those of the producers and sponsors of this podcast.
Dr. Taras Kuzio, welcome back to the podcast. How are you?
Good, thank you. We live interesting times.
We do indeed. We do indeed. Now, in case there are listeners who didn't listen to our previous interview, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm British. I was born in Yorkshire, father Ukrainian, mother Italian. I'd covered the Soviet Union and former Soviet Union for over 30 years. Since doing sort of PhD work, I've written a lot of articles, academic media articles, as well as books. I've just literally yesterday sent off a new manuscript on the invasion called Fascism and Genocide, Russia's War Against Ukrainians. I was planning to retire, kind of gradually retire, shall we say, moving back to England from Holland this year, but Putin hasn't allowed that.
No, indeed. He's keeping us all awake at night at the moment, isn't he?
Yes.
Thank you very much for all that. So, I suppose the first question I would ask really is just what are your views on the kind of current situation on the ground? How many lives have been lost since the war started? Because I think when we last spoke, I believe it was like the end of February, early March, and an awful lot has happened since then. I just wanted to sort of get an idea of how sort of things are, what the state of play is in Ukraine at the moment.
There's simply no question that the reason why Russia is firing huge numbers of missiles is not only because Putin feels threatened at home, he looks weak in the face of Ukrainian victories, but also because Russia is, in effect, losing the war. Russian soldiers are either unwilling or afraid to face Ukrainian soldiers head on. And so they preferred always artillery or missile strikes. The number of Russian casualties is just astronomical. This morning, the Ukrainians are claiming 63,000 Russian dead. The American sort of Western estimate is lower, but it's interesting that the American estimate keeps creeping up to the Ukrainian over the last few months. Now, military analysts always say wounded is 2 to 3 times more than killed. So if really we are talking 50, 60,000 dead, then the numbers incapacitated from the war are anything approaching 150,000. The American estimate was a few months ago 80,000 dead and wounded. Now, if we compare this to 7,000 US dead over 20 years in both Iraq and Afghanistan, we can see the difference. and also Soviet casualties in Afghanistan over 10 years of 15,000. So this is on an astronomical level. On the Ukrainian side, Zelensky's talked about 10,000 Ukrainian dead. It's probably a slight underestimate, but certainly far fewer than the Russian. The biggest, a large number of casualties were in the early part of the summer when Russia was using just indiscriminate artillery fire in the Donbass region, typical Russian tactics, and Ukraine really had nothing to respond with. That's, of course, changed on the battlefield with the arrival of German, Czech, Norwegian, and in particular American heavy howitzer type artillery, and in particular the HIMARS. That's changed it in favor of Ukraine because those have targeted Russian arms dumps, so they don't have the artillery shells to fire at Ukrainians anymore. In terms of civilians killed, aside from Mariupol, anything up to 20,000 or so killed, particularly women and children, because the men really are in the fighting forces. Ukraine has about 1 million mobilized security forces. The port of Mariupol, which was completely flattened by Russia in the spring, there the estimates are literally up to 100,000 dead of a pre-invasion population of 450,000.
Yeah.
This is, to put this into context, this is about 5 times more, or even more than 5 times more, killed in Mariupol than when the Nazis occupied Mariupol in World War II.
Wow.
And this is a country allegedly coming to denazify Ukraine. So the numbers are horrific, hence why there's a lot of claims that this is actually war crimes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the Ukrainian forces have been doing an amazing job. I mean, it's shameful to say it now, but I think the expectation was very low at the beginning of the war of how well they would do. But they've humiliated the Russian forces from what I can see. I don't know if you have any sort of thoughts, observations on how well the Ukrainian army have done.
What was interesting about this war, about this invasion, is the degree to which both Western experts and the Kremlin, and so-called Russian experts, Russian government officials, were on the same page in both exaggerating Russian military power and in belittling Ukrainian attempts at resistance. It's interesting how many Western, particularly American, so-called experts, I remember the Pentagon and Western governments were getting their advice from these experts, and so they were saying the same things. They were saying as well, like with Russians, that Ukraine would last 2 to 3 days because Russia would impose air superiority over Ukraine, and the Russian forces would simply overwhelm Ukrainian. And Russian forces even brought with them parade uniforms to do a victory parade on the main thoroughfare of central Kyiv. That never happened. And I think the reasons for this are very deep. I think there's a lot of what we have in the West is that experts on Russia believe that they are experts on the entire former Soviet Union when they're not. It's the only region of the world where experts from one country believe they're experts on many countries. I mean, if you're an expert on Brazil, you're not an expert on Latin America. If you're an expert on Thailand, you're not an expert on Asia. But for some reason, Russianists think that they're experts on Ukraine, and this has shown that they're obviously not. They underestimated the already existing training and reforms in the Ukrainian military, which have been taking place over the last 10 years. In effect, Ukraine already had the embryo of a NATO military force by the invasion. And also they underestimated the degree of civil society, volunteer groups, and they're all important working in the background because many of those people either supply forces or help in different ways, like with emergencies and rescue. But they also joined the Territorial Defense Force, which is 200,000 people. And I think all of that was underestimated. This had catastrophic consequences because Western governments did not want to send weapons to Ukraine prior to the invasion, believing that because Ukraine wouldn't last longer than 3 days, it would be a waste of time. A lot of them were also under the influence of what happened in Afghanistan with the catastrophic withdrawal. So the only things that Western governments talked about sending were things like javelins and stingers to use by partisan forces under a Russian occupation. Of course, all of that changed as soon as they saw that Ukraine could hold its ground. The other reason why the Ukrainians are doing well is twofold, and thank God this is the case. Firstly, again, Western experts ignored the fact that Russia is a mafia state. The first time Russia was described as a mafia state was in 2010 by a Spanish judge. The document's available on WikiLeaks if any of your listeners want to go and find it. For the last 20 years, Russia's been described as this heavily corrupt. I mean, mafia state isn't just corruption. There's corruption in most countries. This is way, way far deeper and a stagnant, corrupt country. Now, if that's the case, why did Western experts assume that the Russian military would be exempt from this corruption? Well, no. If the country is a mafia state, that impacts on everything in Russia, including the security forces, the military. And because of that, the Russian military simply has been shown not to be the second most powerful army in the world, as the Kremlin claim. For example, and there's countless examples of this, but for example, on questions of logistics, the Russian state cannot supply the Russian army in the field. And that in turn has lots of consequences, for example, for morale. So that's one aspect why the Russian military is not doing very well, why it has to rely on things like missiles as opposed to fighting in the field. And the second reason is because of national identity. I was very flummoxed just prior to the invasion why Russia only mobilized 175,000 troops. Now, usually an invading force needs to be at least 2 to 3 times more than a defending force to overwhelm it. For example, 1968, the Warsaw Pact invaded Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia then had a 10 million population. There were 250,000 troops which invaded Czechoslovakia, simply overwhelmed the country.
Yeah.
It was impossible to put up resistance. So 175,000 invade a country far, far larger than Czechoslovakia, and with security forces far, far bigger. So at the time that Russia invaded, Ukraine had probably about 400,000. So there wasn't even enough to take on Ukraine's security forces, never mind occupy the whole country. The reason why Russia only mobilized a small number of troops wasn't just because they didn't have them because of corruption, but also because Russian, as the Americans call it, the Russians had drank their own Kool-Aid. They'd begun to believe their own stereotypes and myths about Ukraine, that if they invaded, kicked out this small clique of Nazis that had come to power during the Euromaidan Revolution, Zelensky, the president, would have fled, and these majority of the population who are little Russians would greet them with flowers. This was the mythology that the Russians believed in. And by the way, most of them still believe this. Incredible. So if you're launching a so-called special military operation just to remove Nazis from power and believing that the population in general is going to support you, because they're all really Russians, right? I mean, they're all the same ethnic group. Putin's been saying Ukrainians and Russians are one people for over a decade. Then you're simply misconstruing Ukraine, showing you don't understand the country. And this gets on to a topic we'll talk about later, about the Russian intelligence agencies have nothing to do with intelligence. And I think all of those factors combined together have shown to what degree Russia has pursued a very, very bad military campaign. Other factors as well, you could add more purely military factors are Russia has never been successful in imposing an air superiority over Ukraine. Now, this is one of the things that Western experts said that Russia would do within the first few days. It's never been able to do it. And in fact, in the last couple of months, Ukraine dominates the air. Can you believe it? Ukraine with this, it's kind of like this Battle of Britain's small air force. combating Russia, but Ukraine is dominating. Secondly, Western experts kind of played up Russian military reforms, and we now see that they were bogus, and also that a lot of the money put aside for those reforms was stolen. And so Russia has never been able to launch a combined military operation using battalion tactical groups, air force, and artillery. There's never been a combined arms operation in Ukraine. Thirdly, at the beginning, Russian forces had 3 different commands: one for Kyiv, one for Donbass, one for southern Ukraine. There was no unified military operational command for Ukraine, and that also dealt a blow to Russian military tactics and strategy. And I still don't think today there is one overall military kind of. There is a commander, but whether he operates a kind of a unified approach is difficult to see, because Russian military goals in Ukraine keep changing. I mean, is it to occupy Ukraine? Is it to remove the government? Is it to denazify? What is the goal? Or is it just to hold on, as it is now, I think, just to hold on to what they've occupied? Because they don't simply have the numbers to occupy the country, and everywhere they go, they are unpopular. I mean, there's no place in Ukraine, really, where Russian military forces have had local support, so which they expected to have. So hence the farce of the so-called sham referendums a few weeks ago, and the annexation of those territories, which lasted a couple of days before huge portions of them were liberated. I think on a final note, I would say that the way to look at this is similar, and I've written about this, is similar to why Azerbaijan won its war against Armenia in 2020. It's the same reasons. Azerbaijan and Ukraine have NATO-trained forces. They have Western military equipment, particularly, for example, Turkish drones. They're facing Armenia and Russia, who are trained still in basically Soviet military style, i.e. very hierarchical. And they're using outdated Russian military equipment. I mean, Russia, this supposed great power, had to beg Turkey for drones. Turkey refused. And then he had to go to Iran, because Russia never invested, like Armenia, in drones. It sort of stuck to this Soviet mentality that tanks are the thing to have, these big tanks. So I think you've got the same dynamic. Azerbaijan, Armenia, Ukraine versus Russia, a modern 21st military force fighting a military force stuck in the 20th century. And you see this with military tactics in Ukraine, and you saw that with Azerbaijan. Just even the differences on how special forces, Ukrainian and Azerbaijani special forces were trained by NATO, and for example, Turkey, US. Russian so-called Spetsnaz operate in a completely different way. They're inflexible. They operate as a kind of a pack as opposed to like individuals. They're very hierarchical. In the Kharkiv counteroffensive, Russian officers fled. Those Russian soldiers didn't know what to do, and so they either were killed, they were captured, or they simply ran away, leaving all their equipment behind. Ukraine has captured more military equipment from Russia than the West has supplied to Ukraine. And so, whereas in a kind of a NATO Ukrainian military operation, there are NCOs. There are no NCOs in the Russian army. They did begin to introduce them after 2008. This was stopped in 2012 when Putin came back to power and he installed Shoigu. Neither Shoigu as defense minister or Putin have any military experience, and they're running the campaign. So those NCOs and sergeants, I mean, they are able to fill the vacuum if the senior officers are fled, and they also provide autonomy. Ukrainian forces, just like NATO forces, don't need to be told instructions from central headquarters every hour or every day. they operate independently, and if something happens, they can adapt. This is simply not the case with Russian forces. That makes them very inflexible and makes them prone to high casualties. Just lack of discipline. One example: when Ukraine sends out these surveillance drones to locate where Russians are holed up in trenches, and then they send artillery or other drones to attack them. One way they find these Russians is just huge amounts of litter scattered everywhere. There's like loads of stuff over the field. Giving yourselves away. There's like a lot, and there's countless examples of this. There was one video I saw of a drone attack on a Russian tank. Why did they find it? 15 Russians were sat on top of a tank at night watching a video. This surveillance found them, and they just slammed that tank. They were all dead. Just go, hide in the forest or something. Watch the video separately. And so this kind of clumsiness, I guess, a lot of Russians use their mobile phones to ring home to wives, girlfriends, family. And the Ukrainian Secret Service, the SBU, tapes a lot of these calls and then releases them. And it's mind-boggling, some of the stuff they talk about. One of the things they talk about a lot is the incompetence of Russian officers, their corruption and cowardness. So if you combine all of that together, you get very low morale on the Russian side, very high morale on the Ukrainian. The more Russians hit missiles, the more war crimes are found on the Ukrainian side. That just increases the morale of Ukrainian soldiers. So there you have it. Russia simply is unable to fight Ukraine in the field, and hence it resorts to terror tactics like in Syria.
Yeah, indeed. Well, you just touched upon it with the war crimes. Mass graves have been discovered in towns that have been liberated from Russian occupation. What have we learned about how Russia is treating civilians in captured areas?
Well, it treats them. This is the Russian army today is basically the same Soviet army that raped and pillaged across Poland and Eastern Germany in 1944-45. There's no real difference. They haven't changed. And the reason they haven't changed is because under Putin, Russia went through a re-Sovietization of the regime and also a cult of Joseph Stalin. So it was the cult of war, a cult of bloodshed, a cult of kind of military pompousness. And it's the exact opposite of what happened in Ukraine and other sort of more pro-Western leaning post-communist states, where Europeanization completely changes the mentality of people. Ukraine's gone through decommunization, desovietization. The difference between Ukraine and Russia is that in Ukraine, Stalin is regarded as a criminal by a majority of people. In Russia, he's regarded as a hero. Can you imagine if, like 3 decades after World War II, if an ex-Gestapo officer took power in Germany and launched a cult of Adolf Hitler? Well, you've got an ex-KGB officer in power in Russia who's launched a cult of Stalin. So that cult of violence, cult of bloodshed, impacts upon the population. Added to that, you've had about 15 years of what I would call dehumanization of Ukraine and Ukrainians in the Russian media. From about the Orange Revolution of 2004, there's been constant propaganda in the Russian media, particularly on Russian TV, that Ukraine doesn't exist, it's an artificial country propped up by America, that Ukrainians are a branch of the Russian nation, and those who disagree with that are all a bunch of Nazis. And this is being pumped into people. It's been spread in schools. It's been promoted amongst Russian conscripts in the army. So with that attitude, they're coming into Ukraine, and they're not treating Ukrainians as human beings. They're subhuman. Prior to the Holocaust, and prior to the Ukrainian famine of 1933, the Holodomor, there was at least a decade of that dehumanization. You need to dehumanize the perceived enemy before you then are able to then kill them, because you're not really killing human beings, as it were. You're killing subhumans. That's what happened in both of those cases, and this is what happened in the case of Russia. So when they've occupied areas, in every occasion, there's been rapes, The UN reported a few weeks ago in a major report on these war crimes that raping in Ukraine by Russian forces has ranged from the ages of 4.
Wow.
Did everybody hear that? Age of 4 years old to 82. It's just barbaric, simply barbaric. Pedophilia, mass rapes, older women. And we know that when that is done, it's not just a question of sexual fantasies. This is also a tactic of war. It's a way to put down the population, make them feel because many women who are raped in wartime situations don't want to talk about it. So they're psychologically destroyed by that. These divorces and things like that.
Is that an official tactic, do you think?
You're never going to see a Putin decree saying to do this, of course. But certainly many of the taped recordings of Russian soldiers and also interviews with prisoners of war say that they were told to do this by their officers.
Wow.
There's also sometimes an ethnic element, because in the Kyiv region there were a lot of Russian troops from Buryatia, and so maybe they're encouraged to do this. So this is your chance to, rape Christian women. There's also that probably thrown in. And in that sense, that's similar to Yugoslavia, where Serbs did that against Bosnian women. So the raping is too widespread to assume it's just a one-off case in different places. It's happened everywhere where Russian forces have occupied.
There was also that dreadful castration video, and I don't know how common that is, but that was appalling.
Yeah, the castration, and I've seen a video of one case of beheading. A head was put on a spike.
Wow.
Of the Ukraine prisoners of war. And you add to that massive looting. I mean, the looting is, again, similar to the Soviet army in World War II. It's partly theft, but also partly survival, because their logistics are not working. And simply they were just starving in the Kyiv region, so they went to shops and just looted them. They had no food supplied to them by the Russian government. There is an amusing side to this, because a lot of this loot was then taken to Belarus when they retreated. They sent it from Belarusian post offices back home, and then 2/3 of that was stolen on the way. So that just shows you the rot in Russian society. It's literally from the top to the bottom of this. And this has been created by a regime that came to power saying, we're going to be different to the Yeltsin Wild West of the 90s. And they haven't. In fact, the Russia of today is far more corrupt than the Russia of the 1990s. So, what is difficult to understand, these Russian nationalists who are complaining about the conduct of the Russian army, is that have they just simply woken up today to understand that the reason why the Russian army is doing so badly in Ukraine, or one of the reasons, is because of the regime that they supported under Putin being so corrupt that money was stolen from the Russian army. And it seems like they don't seem to add 2 and 2 and get 4. They blame other factors, when in fact the reasons are quite simple to find. So looting, raping, no attempt to win the hearts and minds of people. Simply no attempt. I mean, that concept is simply beyond them. It's just terror tactics, torture. Sometimes it's to find information about Ukrainian forces, or say the children. There was a case just in the Washington Post a few days ago where 52-year-old woman and her husband were tortured because their son was working in the Ukrainian Secret Service, SBU. And other times just purely for sadism, just purely for enjoyment, as it were. Now, one of the reasons they have a problem is that if you're an occupation force and you have no local support at all, even in so-called Russian-speaking areas where they thought they would certainly have that support, then everybody's a potential enemy. I mean, there was a case in the Kyiv region where one of the best scouts for the Ukrainian military was a I think she was about 80 years old, an old age pensioner. And every time Russian forces came through the village, she telephoned these through to the Ukraine military, and they hit them with artillery. These soldiers never expected that 80-year-old woman to be a spy. Now, is she a spy? Is she a partisan? I don't know in how you define her, but you've got a situation where loads of people are doing that. And there's even Ukrainian government app called Dia to Act, where you could actually download information that you've seen of Russian movement of Russian forces. So in that situation, you're literally surrounded by enemies. And that makes them paranoid. They don't feel comfortable at all in that environment. Well, you obviously didn't realize that Ukraine's a separate country. It's not little Russia.
One big thing then, I mean, with Putin's war on Ukraine, it feels it's really about him and his reputation and his holding on to power. So I suppose my question is multifold, really. It's sort of, how far do you think Putin will go to get what he wants? And I suppose the second part of the question is, if Putin is somehow disposed of, or I don't know, leaves or whatever, is there a positive future for Russia post-Putin?
There's a number of questions here. Let me start first with the fact that even prior to the 2014 or the invasion, Russia was already a declining power. I mean, compared to, say, India or the other BRIC countries, particularly China, of course. Now, no Russians would accept that. They would say, no, we're still a great power. And they claim they have the second best army in the world. Well, what this invasion has shown is that Russia is a declining power, and Russia does not have a second best army in the world. Russia has a Potemkin great army. And the sanctions and the huge numbers of destruction of Russian military equipment. I mean, we're talking about, I forget the numbers, but something up to 2,000 tanks being destroyed. I mean, there are people on Twitter who follow this on a daily basis of how much equipment has been destroyed. Russian soldiers, and 1,200 Russian officers killed. That wipes out a huge, makes the Russian military even worse than it already was. If Russia was to fight NATO now, it'd lose within a few days with what it's got left. It's pulling out tanks that are vintage era from the 60s and 70s. It's that bad a situation.
Wow.
So Western sanctions, combined with that, Russia's decoupling from the globalized economy, all of that is simply going to make Russia slide even further downwards as a great power. This is great for China. China simply has no competition now in its rise as a great power. Russia today is China's younger brother. There's simply no question about it. What you've seen in Eurasia in the last few months, and remember that Russia since the early 90s, not under Putin, or already under Yeltsin, I think they first raised it in 1993. They demanded always that the West recognize Eurasia as Russia's exclusive sphere of influence. That meant no NATO, no EU, enlargement into that area, and no UN peacekeepers. We would do the so-called peacekeeping. Now, Russia as a Eurasian power is gone. The only two countries left in Eurasia, which are Russian satellites, are Armenia and Belarus. Central Asia is now under Chinese influence. Take a look at Kazakhstan, how it's snubbed Russia in the last few months, in particular. And Azerbaijan has a long-standing relationship with Turkey. Turkey helped it be victorious in its war against Armenia. Georgia is alongside Ukraine and Moldova with Europe. So there's only Armenia in the South Caucasus. So that's it. So this Russian sort of empire or sphere of influence in Eurasia is gone.
Yeah.
It's only a matter of time for Armenia to jump ship, and I'm hoping they do, because they are a democratic country. Lukashenko's got nowhere else to go, like Kadyrov in Chechnya, and their fates are bound up with Putin. Everything changed 3 years ago. 2020, constitutional reforms made Putin president for life de facto. His presidency was extended till 2036, but de facto he was president for life. And what changed in Russia then was that Russia moved from a collective leadership, which in the Soviet Union we saw under Brezhnev and those kind of leaders, to a dictatorship. So more towards a Stalinist type of Russia, with no collective leadership. Experts on the Russian security services now talk of the FSB resembling the NKVD under Stalin, no longer the KGB under Brezhnev. So with Putin becoming a de facto president for life, Russia moves from an authoritarian system to a dictatorship, and some even call it totalitarian system. Massive repression domestically, everything's snubbed out. Navalny goes to jail, etc. All the Russian anything that's left in the Russian independent media is snubbed out. That in turn impacts upon external aggression. You have internal aggression against your own people, and you have external aggression against Ukraine. The two are closely interconnected. Some would say Russia's even become a fascist state, and that's gaining a lot of prominence. I remember this debate back to 2015, 2016, when many were opposed to calling Russia a fascist state. That is less the case today, with this hyper mobilization around the symbol Z in support of the invasion. Looks very, very much like 1930s Germany. Yes, Putin is in many ways, his fate is completely tied to the fate of this war. If there's, I think, even one more military defeat, either in the Donbass or in Kherson in particular, I find it difficult to see how Putin can survive. So he is literally holding on by his fingernails. After the Kharkiv successful military operation, which was a shock to Russians, Putin had to do something very quickly, otherwise he was going to be kicked out of power. He's a macho leader. Let's remember his funny photographs of him riding horses with no shirt on, which I could always imagine. I said, if my dad did that at the age of 65, I would disown him. I mean, he no longer does that. Maybe he's put on weight, but you can't look weak if you're a macho dictator. So after Kharkiv, he had to do something to toughen up, to show he's still there, the macho is still there, and he did that with the partial mobilization and with the so-called sham referendums on annexing 4 Ukrainian regions. These were signs of weakness, not strength. The partial mobilization was inevitably going to be a problem, because until the so-called partial mobilization, Russians had basically hidden the war from themselves by seeing it on TV, but sitting on their sofas, not getting involved. The war was far away. They just didn't want to know about it. They gave support to it as long as it didn't affect them personally. Now it's affecting them personally. They could be drafted. They could be killed. I just saw a video this week of a Russian soldier who was mobilized, and 11 days later he was a prisoner in Ukraine. He had 2 days training. 2 days training. So what's happened? 700,000 Russians have fled. Now, if you think about it, 300,000 are mobilized, 700,000 have fled. I mean, that tells you a lot. So they didn't want to oppose the regime. They didn't think there was an opportunity to oppose the regime. I'm quite critical of that. And if the Iranians can do it, why can't the Russians? So they've instead fled, in particular, to places like Armenia and Georgia, which are democratic states where they could oppose the regime. But anyway, they fled. I think Putin wanted them to flee. It's better that they're abroad as opposed to causing trouble at home. So they've mobilized 300,000, but I mean, this is where the problem of corruption comes in again. If you don't have the logistics operation in place to supply troops, which are only 175,000 strong, how the hell do you have logistics to supply troops, which are going to be 300,000 more? Is this simply not possible? And so I predict that this winter is going to be a disaster for Russia, because those troops are going to freeze themselves in those trenches. They don't have warm tents. They don't have warm winter clothing. They don't have proper food supply. They're hated by the locals. Ukraine has all of those things. It has support from the locals in every way you can think of. It will be supplied with, it is already being supplied with warm winter clothing by NATO countries, and it has warm tents and places to stay. Civilians will let them in. So I think that's going to be a disaster, and it's just basically cannon fodder for Putin's imperialism. He doesn't care. He's a sociopath. He doesn't care about the number of lives that are killed, either Russian or non-Russian. We've known that from day one of 22 years ago. If we recall, in the first year of Putin's presidency, the Kursk submarine went down, and he rejected Norwegian and British offers of help for the submarine and allowed 200 sailors to die. So it's nothing unusual there. So he just wants that cannon fodder to basically pad out the trenches and to try to hold the Ukrainians who have the initiative now from moving forward. But they're just going to be huge numbers. They're going to get killed, or many of them are going to surrender. Ukraine has a system in place where they're paid money if they surrender, particularly with their equipment, military equipment, which is, I think, a very good way of encouraging dissent within those Russian troops. Once they hit those trenches and they find out, well, they've already seen they get very little training. Their weapons are often really bad condition. Some of them are from Afghanistan in the 80s. And then they sent, and there's no logistics to back them up. I mean, many of them will say, hey, this is a waste of time. I'm not going to get killed for this. So Putin's fate is very much tied to the outcome of this war, and a war that he started, he's linked to. You're right to wonder where this will lead. And there are a number of reasons for this. In communist states and post-communist states, there's no tradition of military coups. That's something in Southern Europe, Latin America, but you don't have that in Eastern Europe and former Soviet Union. There's just one example where that's the case, and that's 81 in Poland. But on the whole, there isn't that tradition. And I think many of those Russian security and military officers are very much tied to the hip, as it were, to Putin. But I don't see how Putin can survive if there are more defeats. And if he somehow, for example, falls out of a window, which seems to be very common in Russia, then who's going to take over? Well, it's not going to be a Democrat. I mean, let's not be completely idealistic. Russian Democrats are not going to come to power. And Navalny is a moderate nationalist anyway. I just don't see him becoming the next Russian leader. So the next person who's coming to power is going to be also a nationalist. But what I think it would be the case is that was more likely to be some kind of pragmatic nationalist who say, it's his fault. So they blame it all on Putin. We know is rubbish, of course, but blame it all on Putin. And we'll try to patch up relations with the West to get rid of sanctions and to try and do some deal on Ukraine, or wherever that means. It's difficult to imagine that if somebody takes over, even if they're a nationalist, and they say, let's continue. Because I think the psychological impact of Putin going would be such a shock to the Russian society that they would go, hold on, there's something, we need to maybe change course here. I mean, that would be my view. Of course, there are more doomsday views, in particular about the use of nuclear weapons, but most kind of leading experts on this find it difficult to get their heads around the use of a tactical nuclear weapon. Because we're not talking about strategic, we're talking about tactical nuclear weapons. Because it doesn't bring any battlefield successes to Russia. If they use a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine, that does not help them on the battlefield. All it does is it's basically those missiles they're firing on steroids. It's a sort of an added attempt at terrorizing the population. But it won't stop Ukraine from conducting its military campaign. And the problem with using something like that as well is that you could kill your own troops. I mean, unless you find just a pure Ukrainian military base. And some of that radiation could go into Belarus or Russia, depending on where the winds are blowing. So, and the final factor linked to that is there's a lot we don't know, of course, what the Americans have threatened the Russians with if they do launch a tactical nuclear weapon. NATO could not stand by. If NATO stood by, it would look very weak. So NATO or the Americans working through NATO would have to do something. And the kind of things that we've heard rumors about are that America would retaliate with devastating conventional weapons, not nuclear, conventional, and would destroy Russian forces in Ukraine and the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Which would mean then that if Russia used a tactical nuclear weapon, Ukraine would win the war.
Yeah.
Because the Russian army would be finished. So I don't see the rationale. Now, what we should be careful on is that using Western rationality in applying that to Putin.
Yeah, definitely.
That's where my argument could fall away, as it were. But so I don't think that tactical nuclear weapons are likely. Now, the West, as of today, is particularly Germany and the US, are talking about finally sending air defense equipment to Ukraine. That's important. I mean, Ukrainians have been asking for this for months. I don't know why they haven't been sent. Israel has been a big disappointment because Israel has not wanted to send its air defense systems either.
Do you have any thoughts on why Israel aren't really contributing? Is it they're too close to Russia, or? For
one thing, you have a Jewish Ukrainian president. Secondly, you have the biggest Jewish revival in Europe taking place in Ukraine, in the city of Dnipropetrovsk, since 1991. And every year, 30,000 Jews, Hasidic Jews, come to Ukraine for a festival in September. So this is the biggest festival outside Israel of where Jews get together. So it is rather strange. And the only argument that I've heard from Israelis of why they have refused to sell arms or support Ukraine is because of Russia's presence in Syria. But I think that's a cop-out. I think it's a real cop-out because, for example, Israel and Azerbaijan have a very close strategic relationship, and Israel sells everything it wants to Azerbaijan. Why? Because Azerbaijan's on Iran's border. And so there's a clear strategic partnership against Iran. And Azerbaijan is a very secular, although Shiite, but very secular society. So there's a great close relationship, but they're not willing to sell those, in particular to the Iron Dome air defense system. They're not willing to sell that to Ukraine. So I think that Israel is one of the number of countries which are a disappointment to Ukraine. But if and when, and they're saying it should be happening in the next few days, American and German air defense systems go to Ukraine, the point of this is going to be that then that blunts the ability of Russia to use missiles to terrorize the population. So what's Russia got left then? It can't fight Ukrainians in the battlefield. Its soldiers are scared to do that. Its casualties are too high. Then it won't be able to use its missiles to terrorize the population. I think you're on a slippery slope to defeat. And you add to that the complications I've already talked about over winter. I can't see this war not finishing in 2023. The former US commander in Europe, Ben Hodges, thinks that Ukraine will be in Crimea by summer of next year.
Thank you so much for all that, because that's been really fascinating. Is there anything else that's important to you that you'd like to discuss that we haven't touched upon today?
Well, I think there's probably two things. I mean, you've mentioned about the Russian intelligence services. I think it's one of the mistakes, another mistake of Western experts is to assume these are intelligence agents. They're not. Not when you compare them to CIA, FBI, or MI5, MI6. They're corrupt institutions. So their primary purpose is corruption. They also have very, very misconstrued views of the outside world. So they don't get it. They don't understand Ukraine. They don't understand Russia's neighbors in Eurasia. And they certainly don't understand the West. So one of the major problems that Russia has faced in this war is that they misunderstood Ukrainian reaction to the war, and they misunderstood Western reaction. Now, that's the fault of intelligence agencies. I mean, they simply, I think, are very, very bad. I mean, they got a lot of money prior to the invasion, the Russian intelligence services, to bribe Ukrainians and to recruit spies in Ukraine. That money was stolen. And when it was given, what was left that wasn't stolen, given to the Ukrainians, they stole it. And they basically told the Russian intelligence services what they wanted to hear. So it was a complete mess. So then these Russian intelligence agencies pass this information upwards to Putin and tell him what he wants to hear. Because you're not going to tell Putin, hold on, I think this is not a great idea, because you're on the first train to Siberia. Yeah. So again, you have the classic problem of a dictatorship, that nobody wants to tell a dictator bad news. And so you've got this hierarchical problem of simply bad information, bad lack of intelligence. So I think we need to have a different viewpoint of how we look at these so-called Russian intelligence services, because they're not good. They're actually shown in Ukraine to be actually very, very poor structures, and I think very low IQ officers, and simply they don't understand how the world operates, how the West operates. I mean, they were absolutely convinced that the West would be weak, divided, and simply easy to deal with, as it was in 2014. So they got that completely wrong. I think the second factor, and probably final factor, is just the question of NATO. You now have a situation where one of the best, or near the top of the best armies in Europe is Ukraine. Battle trained, battle experienced, large military force, high military budget, which is not the case in NATO. There's still only about 12 out of 30 NATO members spend 2% of GDP, a requirement since 2006. And so I think Ukraine has deserved its place as a member of NATO. NATO has been promising to bring in Ukraine since 2008. It's actually, I think, sent a lot of confusing signals about that. Finland and Sweden were invited to join within a few days. I think Ukraine has earned its place. And let's not go into the arguments used against that in the past were always that there's not enough support in Eastern Ukraine for NATO membership. That's no longer the case. Opinion polls now show East Ukrainians support NATO membership as much as West Ukrainians. And the second argument was that we can't provoke Russia. Well, I'm sorry, Russia's already done that.
Yeah.
So the third argument, and again, it's interesting here, is that, well, you can't really invite countries in where some of their territory is occupied. You've obviously forgotten your own history. West Germany was invited to join NATO in the 50s when East Germany was under Soviet occupation. Germany wasn't a unified country until 1990. So, and it was allowed to join NATO. Cyprus was allowed to join the EU, and northern Cyprus is occupied by Turkey. So let's not use double standards when applied to Ukraine. I think Ukraine is defending Europe against Russia. If Ukraine fails, if Ukraine is defeated, I don't think it will be, then next is NATO.
Yeah.
Direct war with NATO.
Yeah.
Baltic states, Poland, maybe elsewhere. So I think Ukraine has won its place inside NATO. Thank you.
Yeah, rightly so. Thank you so much for your time today. I've really enjoyed that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me, and stay tuned because this war will still go on at least until next year.
Yeah, indeed.
Thanks for listening. This is Secrets and Spies.